Welcome to What's New, a podcast by the Arctic Institute and the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. I'm Serafima Andreeva, I'm your host, and today we will be talking about the United States in the Arctic. We have an expert on these topics with us here today, Gabriella Gricius, a postdoc at the University of Constance and affiliated with the Arctic Institute and Nansen. Gabriella, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Really excited to have you here as well. So when we look at the Arctic for the United States, what is it? Is it primarily prioritized by military, economic aspects? What is it?
So I think it comes with a lot of different dimensions. On one hand, you have the military dynamic, which is really important. So I think how the US thinks about the Arctic is through this geopolitical security lens. It says Russia has, 50% of the Arctic. We've seen increasing militarization since around 2015. We've seen China increasing presence, not linearly, not perhaps in a way that could be perceived as militarization. But for the United States, this is kind of a warning sign. They look at this and they say, we need to also be here because the other two great powers are here. How I like to think about the US and the Arctic is really this back foot reluctant power, this sense that we haven't had the presence in the Arctic over time. We haven't invested in the same way as our allies and adversaries. So now we need to catch up. And this started in 2019, but really has been expanding over time with all of the different military documents that have come out from the different military parts of the US, but of course the Arctic strategy that came out in 2022. And then there is, of course, the domestic side as well. So there's the question of oil and gas resources in Alaska. And this is also a really important part of how the US thinks about the Arctic, particularly the new Trump administration. Domestic side, energy and resources, military side, and the environmental side for the Arctic for the United States is, of course, vastly different now during the current administration than it was during the last one.
And how does Trump view the Arctic? I mean, we know that he's interested in Greenland, but is he interested in his own backyard, Alaska?
So it's actually been really interesting, I think, because when we think about what things have changed, we think about Greenland, right? It's the first thing you say, well, how is the new Trump administration handling this? He wants Greenland. Does he want Canada as the 51st state? All of these things that seem really ridiculous, I think, are the obvious changes here. But I think the primary shift has to come from prioritization. So during the Biden administration and kind of broadly in US Arctic policy, there's been these dual holders of climate change, scientific research, minerals, also military competition. But during the Trump administration, there was this prioritization shift where now national security is the most important thing above all. So things like climate change, which were a really essential part of the 2022 document, are almost removed, right, from how the Trump administration deals with the Arctic, which makes no sense, as this, of course, doesn't also just have environmental impacts, but also military impacts in terms of infrastructure on permafrost, many other downstream effects that the military are extremely familiar with. But instead, it seems to me that the Trump administration has been focused on icebreakers, the all-famed icebreaker gap. Because, of course, the US does not have very many icebreakers. So building this back up has been a really central thing for the Trump administration. Interestingly, not very different from the Biden administration. And actually, the ICE Pact, which was signed between Canada, Finland, and the US, has continued to operate during the Trump administration, which many commentators were quite concerned about. So that hasn't changed. Climate has very much changed. And I think it really is just a question of where is the US government putting their attention? And unfortunately, some things fall to the wayside, like ARCUS, right? Which was a really important scientific organization that was partially funded by the US government. That's now not here anymore. So it has to do a lot with time. And at least according to the Trump administration, there's limited resources and they should only be spent on military security.
I mean, if I can ask you a follow-up question about icebreakers, I love this topic because more often than not, especially maybe in non-Arctic discussions, you end up tying icebreakers, or icebreakers are frequently tied up to military capacity. And it's so fascinating to hear the United States talk about this. So why do they care so much about icebreakers? Is it because of the same, you could say, great power, symbolic power ambitions we can see in Russia and in China, the power given to an icebreaker in itself? Or is it more practical concerns, like what we can see in Canada, for example?
I think it does have to do a lot more with symbolism at the end of the day, because we don't have that much of an Arctic to navigate through. I think compared to Russia, for example, which is often talked about as terms of having 40 or 50, whatever number, we choose to use icebreakers, there's a lack of understanding that those are actually needed for civilian vessels to navigate through different parts of the Russian Arctic. And we simply don't have that issue as much with just having Alaska. But one of our icebreakers has been used to also conduct scientific operations in the Antarctic space. So for that reason, for a long time, we had one icebreaker that we used for this, but it was always half of the time in the Antarctic, half the time in the Arctic. So, it was serving a dual purpose there. But I think currently they're much more for a symbolic purpose. But that said, I think from a US perspective, not being able to operate in a strategic environment that it perceives as being a realm of competition is a problem, even if perhaps from a practical perspective, we don't need it, because there are so many allies with icebreakers that we could work with instead.
And it's great to have a shiny toy, a shiny new icebreaker either
exactly.
way. And it reminds me of China as well. I mean, most of their capabilities is in the Antarctic, icebreaking capabilities. But you mentioned the priorities and the strategy from 2022 being climate and science, and this is clearly not the case anymore. The new administration, it does not acknowledge the climate crisis in the same way as maybe anyone at this point, in the West at least. So the same with science and knowledge debates. So the most important forum where climate and science and international cooperation meet are in the Arctic Council. And what do you think will happen to the Arctic Council with the Trump administration? We've been talking about, on Arctic Council debates, there's been talk about Russia as a risk, these kinds of things. But what is happening with Trump?
Yes, I think you raise a really interesting point, and I'm glad you brought this up too, because I think when we talk about the Arctic Council, we often say, oh, well, there's the Arctic 7 and Russia, which is a misnomer for many reasons. But now we face this challenge where should we expect the US to invest in the Arctic Council? I think what I instead see is that we'll probably see a lot of the same behavior that we did during the first Trump administration. So during that time, there was a lot of pushback on having climate wording in the documents. And so I expect we'll see that again. But what I'm hoping that we'll see is not the same sort of attempted leadership that we saw during the Trump administration. So there's a famous speech that Mike Pompeo gave in the Arctic Council where he talked about the Arctic being a new theater of strategic competition. And of course, everyone loves this quote. It's easy. You can say 2019, strategic competition. Check. That's how the US sees the Arctic. And my concern is that this would happen again, that the US would say, oh, this is another forum through which we can exert our normative power here by pushing back against Russia, pushing back against China, pushing back against science and climate, all of these things bound up together. And so, but what instead I think we'll see is that this second Trump administration seems much less convinced on multilateralism than the first one did. So perhaps this will mean that they simply won't be as interested in the Arctic Council, send someone who doesn't have as much interest in being involved. And this, I think, would be a huge benefit. We've talked about, can the Arctic Council slide under the radar of great power politics, and instead can continue to exist somewhat in the shadows. This is, I think, I don't know. I'm unsure what to make of this, because on one hand, we want the Arctic Council to continue. It's an important forum for scientific research, for indigenous engagement with Arctic climate science and governance. Yet, is it enough that it just continues to exist? Like, does it not need to do its own work too? And what is the point of an institution just continuing on, like barely, holding on? Someone recently said it's just a shell company. Do we want that to continue? If so, maybe we don't want the US to be involved because we want them to be kept outside. But, there's a lot of different choices to be made about how to continue it or not.
Can I come with a hypothetical scenario?
Of
And
course.
I want your take on this. So this is, I'm stepping far outside the researcher role and far inside the podcast host.
Yeah.
So what is happening right now in the Arctic Council for our listeners is that currently the chairship, which is rotating every 2 years of the council, is in Denmark/Greenland's hands, or Greenland primarily. And I'm thinking, could they look at Greenland as the Arctic Council as an arena to influence Greenland or to get Greenland? Do you think, or do you think they even think that far in those terms of Arctic politics? What's your take on that?
Is it a place to get Greenland or a place to try to lure Greenland in, right? Does it need to be pushy? I mean, maybe we don't know how thoughtful the Trump administration is being about wanting to get Greenland. Because there could be a way, I could see it, in which they say, well, we want Greenland, we want to really push them to try to get more control of them or whatever the case may be. This would be a fundamental misunderstanding of the Arctic Council, I think. And would it then lead to the Kingdom of Denmark having to step up and defend part of its territory? Like what would that look like? And then would that not lead to further resentment down the line between Denmark and Greenland? It's impossible to say. What I think might instead happen, if they're more thoughtful about this approach, is using the Arctic Council as a way to develop closer relations with Greenland, saying, we'll support you in this. You want this? The Kingdom of Denmark is pushing back. We'll be your partner on this project. Are they that, thoughtful? Probably not. But
Trump administration, take notes.
Take notes.
This is a perfect policy recommendation for you. I mean, I really want to jump to myths and misconceptions in the Arctic, but I also want to kind of spend a bit more time on Greenland, because I want to ask you why, or what's the United States' interest in Greenland? Where does it come from? I mean, I've heard people say that it has something to do with only domestic policy, showing MAGA voters, and other people saying it has to do with Europe being independent. And there's many takes on this. What do you, an expert on this, what do you think?
There are reasons for longstanding U.S. interest in Greenland. I'm loath to, admit it because I don't like feeding into this narrative, but it's true that there are reasons why the U.S. has had a presence in Greenland for a really long time. And it mostly has to do with homeland defense. So during the Cold War, when there was fear from the U.S. that missiles would come from the Soviet Union, nuclear missiles, come over Europe, come into the U.S., Greenland was really needed to help detect these radars, and that's what eventually led to the setup of Thule Air Base, now known as Pitufik Space Base. Initially, this was all about radar protection. It was also then a maritime capacity really important for the GI-UK gap, so the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And this gap from a maritime perspective is important because for the Russian submarines to get into the North Atlantic, they have to pass through this kind of relatively small gap. And so the US having a presence on Greenland helped them develop better surveillance capabilities to protect or at least see what was happening in the North Atlantic. So for historic reasons, Greenland has been very important. The US continues to have a presence on Pitufik. There's a lot of relationships there. What it's also important for is, of course, critical minerals, which is the buzzword when it comes to the Arctic today. This is, again, I think true in the sense that there are critical minerals on Greenland. It's a more complicated question when it comes to who has the right to mine them. Do they want to mine them? What does it look like from a regulatory capacity? Actually, the logistical capacity to do this, it's really complicated. And so I think for the Trump administration, they see critical minerals. They don't see GI-UK gap, but they see homeland defense. And I think these two factors make Greenland important for the United States. And you brought up another thing too, which is the domestic factor. There's this sense, I think, that Trump in a domestic capacity wants to be seen as this really powerful leader. He wants to be able to be the first US president in a long time to not only just be retrenching, but expand America's influence in a way that it hasn't been able to do in a really long time. And so Greenland seems to be an easy way to do that. Of course, it's not. But, the idea is there. So I think there's a lot of different interests that come up. Homeland defense, critical minerals, this domestic element here that all play really important roles. But what's frustrating to me is that the US and Greenland have a close relationship, whether we're talking about military, whether we're talking about economics, these different types of partnerships that have developed over time. And so the fact of the matter is the US is getting everything that they want out of Greenland that they are getting right now. And buying Greenland, having a free association agreement, none of this would really change all of that.
I want to dive a bit more into the misconceptions, myths part of the Arctic, which we love to talk about. For our listeners, me and Gabriella, we have been on panels and pubinars talking about this. This is our favorite topic. We go to sleep thinking about this. What are some myths or misconceptions that you can see surrounding the United States in the Arctic?
I think my favorite one I already mentioned is that the US is not a very strong Arctic power. I think it likes to portray itself in the world and as this global superpower, and it is, right, a global superpower on the world stage. But I think so often what an uninformed observer misses is that we can't just import superpower to be regional power in every region. And this is certainly true in the Arctic, whether you talk about icebreaker capacity, whether you talk about diplomatic presence, expertise, and expert community. The US just does not have this in the same way that a state like Norway has, for example. And so I think paying attention to this lack of presence in the same way is really important, because often I think it's understood, oh, well, the US is in the Arctic now, so now we can rely on them 100%. I would say no. Shouldn't you not rely, or at least understand that there are other states that have history, expertise of being in the region? So that's probably the most important myth, I would say. And the second is that the US sees the Arctic as this realm of great power competition. And the myth is that it's not 100%, right? From a US perspective, they might see it in this way, but really pushing back against that myth is really important, because I think it allows us then to say it's not just US, Russia, and China scrambling for control of the Arctic, but rather that there's just a lot more going on in terms of climate, in terms of indigenous people, economic changes, technological changes. We need to incorporate all of these different dimensions happening. And then one last myth from a domestic perspective in Alaska. I think there is a misconception that all indigenous people, as like a blanket term, are against economic development in Alaska. And this is not true. There's a lot of diversity from different groups that want different types of extractive industries built. And too often, there's just this term of, well, the Trump administration wants to develop the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, but this is coming at the cost of every single indigenous person in Alaska. No, many, but not all. So paying attention to that nuance, making sure we're being clear about who is actually against it, who is for it, what actually are the benefits of doing this type of economic development is really important. And then one final myth that's just come to my mind now about Alaska is that when we talk about what are the security threats in Alaska, the only US Arctic territory in the region, it's common, I think, to say, oh, we're so close to Russia. As Sarah Palin would put it, she could see Russia from her house in Alaska. So this is not the primary threat. The threat is climate change. And the best way to think about this has to do with this concept known as managed retreat. And that's where there are coastal communities in Alaska that are quite literally having to pick up their homes and move away from the coastline where they live. And this is a huge threat. Like, I can't imagine from a personal perspective saying my home, my societal security, for many people, their spiritual security and their sense of being is so tied to these places. And then to watch the water literally rise up, that's the threat. And so making sure that that's clear.
You mentioned also different perspective of the indigenous people of Alaska on development. We have the same in Norway as well, is that some are very for economic development and certain forms of resource extraction, and others are not. It's important to view everyone as separate actors and not file them into one single group. I want to go a bit closer to Alaska, the neighbor to Alaska and the neighbor to the US, of course, Canada. We have the Northwest Passage. I was just visiting Canada, and I have never heard people talking so much about the Northwest Passage as I've heard in Canada. Yeah. And now I'm coming back, I'm like, oh, maybe we should talk about the Northwest Passage, because the US and Canada, they have slight disagreements on this. What's your take on the current situation?
So I think it is, let's take a step back.
Yeah.
This is a long-standing issue. There have been disagreements for a long time. Currently, so since around the 1980s, there's been a consensus of agree to disagree. Canada and the US have very different interpretations of the Northwest Passage. Canada sees it entirely as internal waters, whereas the US does not. But there is an understanding that the US isn't just going to send ships through the passageway, because this is, of course, Canada, one of the US's closest allies. But there was some dramatic incidents that happened again in the 1980s, long time ago. Things have been relatively stable since then. But as you mentioned, it's come up a lot in the news recently. So will the US unilaterally send ships through the region? To my mind, no, this is not happening. I think it doesn't serve the US purposes, even if Trump might have a rhetoric about it. It won't actually occur because there are so many general, so many operational reasons why this doesn't make sense. More than that, it's really hard to transit through the Northwest Passage. It's not as easy as just saying, yeah, we're going to take a cruise ship from Maine to Washington, D.C. That's true. Never underestimate ice. It's a really challenging route as well. So I think it's not going to happen. And the reason that it won't come to blows as well, you know, metaphorical blows, not actual conflict blows, no bombs, let me just say, is that Canada and the US, but mostly the Canadian side, have an interest in maintaining what I would call a low-key approach to handling their relations with the United States. They understand that that relationship, while very close, has recently been relatively unstable. And so maintaining this, we work together so closely on NORAD, we work together for homeland defense, it's not worth risking the political rhetoric that we might have seen in previous Canadian administrations, like the Harper administration, for example. That said, there have been, in recent documents from the Canadian government, talk about expanding surveillance of the Northwest Passages, of increasing infrastructure as well. We, of course, can't ignore the role of Indigenous people in Canada as well. But it remains to be seen, you know, how much of this modernization will actually take shape, how long it's going to take. But I really don't see there being any sort of conflict between the United States and Canada over this.
This reminds me a bit of a rocky marriage. Like, you kind of want to mend it. We've had some conflicts in the past. Let's keep this conflict away for now.
Yes, but we can't name it. That's key. It's key. We can't actually say, I don't know, X, Y. This she didn't actually cheat on me. We're not going to talk about it, but I know.
Oh, this is only before therapy.
Yeah, this is before therapy.
That's US and Canada.
Yes,
That's actually all we need to know.
Perfect.
So based on this, so as a therapist, as an international relations specialist, and this is actually a therapist role just for a state, you could say, please come with some recommendations. What can the US do? What should the US do?
Well, I have a couple. I know you asked for only one, but I had a couple in my mind. So leave Greenland alone is my first recommendation.
Leave them alone.
Leave them alone. They don't want to be annexed by the United States. This is not what the Greenlandic people want. So just please stop with the rhetoric. Stop with the rhetoric about the Canada and being the 51st state. It's not helping anyone. And I think as an American, it's painful to watch this rhetoric unfold, in front of me on the world stage, because I say, why would the US behave like this? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't serving a strategic purpose. This isn't serving we need to rally the American troops together to fight against some external foe. It's actually making us much weaker because it's making our relationships with our allies weaker. If I were a European state, I would look at how the US is behaving and I would say, why should I trust them? I have to, because we have a security guarantee and the US is part of that understanding that someone's going to come to protect us, but I don't want to. And what a horrible basis for a relationship if we're talking about therapy.
But a lot of toxic relationships going.
So I think maybe reframing it as just taking a step back from this really aggressive rhetoric and understanding that it's not just hurting your relationships, but it's hurting your broader competition with Russia and especially with China. And if we're going to talk about China, because I think with the current administration, it's a little unclear how they see Russia at times. It seems to vary depending on the week, depending on the meeting. Instead, let's focus on China, which we know is, a pretty clear peer competitor on the world stage, not peer competitor in the Arctic. I think for the US, my recommendation would be, again, less focus on increasing Chinese presence and instead understanding that there are diverse ranges of security issues in the Arctic. Military competition is only one of them. There's certainly no question that we're going to see increased presence by the US, by NATO, by other allies in the Arctic, because we're seeing a lot of exercises there. And we need exercises because it'll help us build interoperability. It'll help us be able to operate better there. And the US has already been there in the past at many of these exercises. But now I think it matters more to think about this as only one pillar of a broader strategy. So how can the US, reinvest in scientific research, reinvest in climate change? And if there is hesitancy about naming climate change as a real threat, although we all know here that it is a real threat and the greatest threat to the Arctic, let's instead talk about environmental change. Let's instead think about how is environmental change impacting how the US wants to behave strategically in the region. And I think here my primary thoughts are permafrost under military infrastructure, extreme weather patterns, changing how exercising and presence can happen in the region. These type of things are reality. They're happening, and they impact how the Trump administration has military aspirations in the Arctic. So I would focus on those things and also say, in working with allies, being humble enough to take the back foot. As I said, the US is not a leader in the Arctic, and that's okay. I think
You don't have to be the biggest.
have to be
It's
the
fine.
biggest everywhere. And so, yeah, having that self-understanding, and I think many people in the US government do have this, that the US needs to work with Canada. The US needs to work with Norway, all of the other Arctic states. That's where the Arctic, I think, is so special and how the US can benefit. So leaving Greenland alone, leaving Canada alone, being more cognizant of where it actually is in terms of Arctic capabilities and capacity, and expanding its understanding of Arctic threats to not just be national security and military in nature, but the broader spectrum of security threats.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Gabriella. It's been great to have you. I've learned a lot.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to continue the conversation offline.
You've been listening to What's New. This podcast is supported by the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Arctic Institute. Follow for more on Arctic geopolitics.